Well, this morning we're starting a new series, Things You Can Get Wrong by Reading the Bible. And today we're beginning with contradictions in the Bible. When we were living in Canberra a few years ago, we did a series called The Bible for Atheists. We appealed for questions on our Facebook page, and we had a number of questions to deal with, and I certainly enjoyed the series very much. It was great fun to do, and I hope you'll enjoy everything that we're going to do in the coming series over the next few months. So to begin for today, the most obvious thing is to go to Google and type in contradictions in the Bible, and you come up with many, many lists and pages of contradictions. And there was one in particular that I found was useful, and I'm going to base today's talk on, and it was from a site called infidels.org, and it was compiled by a gentleman by the name of Donald Morgan. But to begin with, he makes this disclaimer, which I found rather interesting. Important. These lists are meant to identify possible problems in the Bible, especially those that are inherent in a literalist or fundamentalist interpretation. Keep in mind, however, that what constitutes a valid problem is to some extent a matter of opinion. You may disagree that these are in fact genuine biblical problems, but it is the author's opinion that a perfect and omnipotent God could, should, and would see to it that such problems did not exist in a book which she or he had inspired. So, I'm going to test the validity of that author's opinion today. I share with you a couple of the contradictions that are in this list, and there's quite a number. If you go to this website, you'll find quite a long list of contradictions. I'll see what you think of these ones. So here's one, that God encourages reproduction, but then God requires purification rites following childbirth, which in effect make childbirth a sin. God does change his mind, as compared to God does not change his mind. At Babel, in the book of Genesis, the Lord confused the language of the whole world. And yet in Paul, we find that he says God is not the author of confusion. And in the Gospels, here we're quoting Matthew's Gospel, he will be called Emmanuel. Instead, he was called Jesus. Now, I think some of these really are clutching at straws. If you look at this list, the complete list, you'll find many which you can fairly easily see for yourself really aren't a problem, and I'll show you some of these as we go on today. But some of them are genuine and they are puzzling, but they are all there for a reason, and that's what we're going to really discuss today. And I'm going to share with you 5 important points to help you navigate the contradictions in the Bible, and they are these. First of all, genre. Second of all, context. What we call appearance and accommodation, what I've called development, and a deeper meaning. So let's just go through these one by one. First of all, genre. Donald Morgan highlights this occurrence in the book of Judges. This is the story of Sisera, who leads an invading army into Israel. And in the story, as it's related in Judges chapter 4, Sisera was sleeping when he is killed. So he takes refuge and hides in a tent with a family, and he's covered with a blanket, and when he's sleeping, he's killed by the woman of the house. But in Judges chapter 5, it says that Sisera was standing when he was killed because he falls down. And what's the difference between these two accounts? Well, it's that the second one is poetry. It's not really intended to describe the truth of the events. It's much more colourful language than that. And so I find it very difficult that anybody would seek to portray poetry as portraying truth. Here's a second example. So we read in Proverbs and various places, happy is the man who finds wisdom, and so we should get wisdom. In the Gospels, Jesus is described as filled with wisdom and that he found favour with God as a result. And then in Paul's writing in the first book of Corinthians, Paul says wisdom is foolishness. Now I wonder if you can reconcile this. Well, what I would suggest is it's all down to what we call rhetoric. Paul, when he speaks about wisdom, is speaking about worldly wisdom as opposed to godly or spiritual wisdom. And it is that worldly wisdom that is foolishness. And you see, so he's employing a rhetorical device in what he is saying. And I think as you read Paul, you can see that very clearly. There's no actual contradiction here. So the second thing that we'll look at is context. And so they quote this problem here. Jesus founds his church on Peter and will give him the keys of the kingdom. And he's quoting here Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16. But then as we go on, only a few verses later, Jesus calls Peter a Satan and a hindrance and accuses him of being on the side of men rather than of God. Now notice how close these two stories or two quotations are. And the context is very important to understand these. You see, when Jesus founds his church on Peter, Peter has just said this. He said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Whereas if we look at the second quotation, what has happened is immediately after that statement of Peter's, and then the Lord has said he's founding the church on Peter, the Lord goes on to talk about his death, his crucifixion, and then his resurrection. And Peter, off the back of the congratulations he's been given from the Lord, says, "Oh no, far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." And then the Lord makes this comment about Peter being a Satan and a hindrance. You see, it's not so much about Peter as about what he's said. And so it's very important for us in understanding any contradiction that we take particular care to understand the context in which something is said. Now, anybody reading the Bible on a literal sense can see those two things, the idea of literary genre and the idea of context. What I'm about to dive into now is fundamental to a Swedenborgian understanding of the word, but it's not quite so clear always to people who are reading the Bible literally. But I hope I can show that it is a clear and obvious way to understand the word. So I'm going to talk about appearance and accommodation. So it says here that Cain went out or away from the presence of the Lord in Genesis. That's after the murder of Abel, if you remember the story. But then in Jeremiah we find that a man cannot hide from God and God fills heaven and earth. Indeed, we've read from Psalm 139 this morning, which says exactly the same thing. And this is all down to what we call appearances of truth. So I'd like to share some passages from Swedenborg with you about this. Appearances of truth are not truths in themselves, but are such as have the appearance of being truths. He goes on to say, no truths with man, nor even with an angel, are ever pure, that is, free of appearances. Natural appearances of truth are for the most part illusions. Rational appearances of truth, however, are more and more interior. So when we talk about Cain going away from the presence of the Lord, we're talking about it from the point of view of Cain, not the Lord. Cain appears as though he leaves the presence of the Lord, but of course the Lord never leaves our presence. My favourite verse in regard to this is the choosing and anointing of David as the next king of Israel. It says in the book, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, alongside the concept of appearance, we have the concept of accommodation, which is very important for us to grasp. Truth from God cannot be received by anyone unless it is adjusted to what he is capable of understanding, and so unless it is seen in a natural shape and form. For initially, human minds can understand only earthly and worldly things, and not at all spiritual and celestial ones. If, therefore, spiritual and celestial things were made plainly visible, they would be cast aside, as if they were worthless. And this accords with the Lord's words in John, where he says, "If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things?" Now, these dual ideas of appearance and accommodation lead us on to quite an interesting idea, which is one of development. As we look at the Word, as we look at the Bible, you can see that developments take place over time. So the people who existed, say, just after the story of creation, or if we talk about Abraham, for example, the things that Abraham understands and believes are not the same as the things that people in the New Testament understand and believe. And particularly we find through the person and the ministry of Jesus that Jesus clashed with the religious scribes and the Pharisees, the religious institution of the time, because he presented the ideas that he had in a new way, in a new understanding. So you can see that from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there is a new way of looking at spiritual truth and having spiritual understanding. And this, of course, is the crux of the problem that Jesus has with the religious authorities of his time. So he wrote, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." But from the eyes of the Jewish authorities, Jesus spent much of his time breaking the rules. For example, the rule about the Sabbath. Now, it's not only with Jesus that we see this development of ideas taking place. If we look at the idea of retribution, for example, we can trace it. It develops through the text of the Bible. It's not the same at the beginning as it is at the end. So in Exodus chapter 21, we have that law, a very well-known law, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that limits the idea of revenge. But as we go later into the Word, even to Deuteronomy and then into Psalms, we find that retribution is actually not taken on by an individual but left to God. Retribution and revenge is God's responsibility and not ours. And then, of course, as we move into the New Testament, we are introduced to the idea of forgiveness, where we put retribution aside entirely. So the Word speaks to all of our individual states, and it calls us forward from wherever we are. We have in Luke's Gospel the parable of the lost sheep, and the Lord talks about the shepherd going to where the sheep is and finding it and carrying it home. And this is what the Lord does for us through the Word. He speaks to us where we are, but He's always calling us on to develop and grow our ideas towards a more spiritual understanding. And of course we also have in Revelation chapter 3 verse 20, the Lord's invitation, "I stand at the door and knock." So to expect the Word to say the same thing consistently is a bit silly in my view. The Word is not about telling us the truth. The Word is about helping us to find it for ourselves and calling us onward to something better and something deeper. And I mean, really, if you think about it, it's silly to expect divine truth to just land in our laps. If you think about, history, recent history, we have come on in our understanding as a society in the last 10 or 20 years. A few months ago, Pam and I went and watched the latest Disney version of Aladdin. That was a film that we had seen not long after we got married. And it's a very different film that was made only a few years ago compared to 20, 25 years ago. So society moves on, and that is of the will of the Lord. And the Lord is constantly seeking us, or for us, to develop our ideas and grow. And finally, I'll mention the deeper meaning. So this is the last contradiction that this gentleman quotes, that Adam was to die on the very day that he ate the forbidden fruit, and yet Adam lived to 930 years of age. And really the only way that you can reconcile something like this is to understand death with a deeper meaning. And I recall to mind again the book of Revelation, chapter 20, where we have it talk about the second death. Now, as far as I know, if we're talking physically, we only die once. So clearly death has something deeper to tell us than merely the death of the physical body. And I think we see it illustrated here, that the death that Adam undergoes at eating the forbidden fruit is not the death of the physical body. So the natural world is the world of appearances and contradictions and paradox. And we've been exploring that for quite a number of weeks now. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The book that I've waved around before, The Paradoxes of Group Life, we've talked about the way that in joining any group or community, we seek like-minded people. We seek people that we have a commonality with. But the contradiction is that we don't truly feel accepted for who we are until those same people accept our differences alongside our similarities. Another contradiction is the way that we watch people and the way that we look at people. We watch the way people act, and we ascribe a particular motive based on what we see of their actions. But frequently, we are just plain wrong. So there's a contradiction there between what we see and what is truly happening. Even when we talk about science, there are inherent contradictions. I was always at school a great fan of quantum mechanics, and one of the particular ideas that I was fascinated with was the wave-particle duality. The idea that light, which is a wave, can behave like a particle, and the idea that an electron, which is a particle, can behave like a wave. Now, of course, anybody looking at that and not knowing what they're talking about is going to see that as a contradiction. And one of the great contradictions I find is with atheists themselves. If I was to identify a God of the atheists, and by that I mean an organising principle of the universe, an organising principle of the world, what might that be? Well, it might be the theory of evolution. But the thing is that if you look at human activity, human endeavour, and it's not only Christians, it's atheists too, we spend a great deal of time and effort in healthcare, in saving the sick and the weak and the elderly. But what are we doing in evolutionary terms? So if you think about the theory of evolution, it is the survival of the fittest. And it is because of the survival of the fittest that the species grow and develop and maintain itself. But if we spend a great deal of time maintaining that weak genetic code, then we are trying to work against the theory of evolution that we claim is the organising principle of our universe. You see, evolution sacrifices the individual for the good of the species, but we end up sacrificing the good of the species for the individual. Now I wonder who's going to win that race. So when Mr. Morgan says a perfect and omnipotent God could, should, and would see to it that such problems did not exist in a book which she or he had inspired, is that true? The problem is not the word, but it's the attitude that we come to the word with. So I'm going to come back to what I talked to the children about, and that is our bed. As I said, our doctrine, our ideas, those ideas that we feel most comfortable with, the concepts that help us organise and understand our world, that is our bed. That is what our mind rests in. But of course, the story that I read from John's Gospel, and it's not the only time Jesus uses these words. He says, "Arise, take up your bed and walk." Get out of your comfort zones. Look at the contradictions around you. Look at the contradictions present in the Word and actually begin to process them. Think about what they mean, not in terms of whether we dismiss the Word or not, but in what way do they actually challenge our own thinking and ideas. And so that's what I want you to do this week. I want you to keep your eyes open for contradictions. Contradictions in your interaction with other people, contradictions in your circumstances, contradictions in your natural life, and then of course contradictions as you read the Word. And I want you to think about how they can be reconciled with one another. Are they a matter of style or appearance or accommodation? Or is the Lord leading you to a renewed and deeper understanding of spiritual principles?